All right. And everyone, please not on mute today. So pretty good. Good start, I think. All right. I even confessed on Moodle. There's always something, but oh well. We just did the course outline, so it's not a big deal. All right. This week, pretty ambitious, yeah. Oh boy. I know, I wish it would just be a normal door and not lock. All right, but hopefully today's video will be better, and that's when we have the material, so we're all good. Like I said, I have an ambitious chapter 1 today. I was joking around that I'm coming full circle to using the slides that someone else has made. It's kind of where you start, and then at one point I had written my own textbook that I was kind of using, and then I went back to just writing notes in class, and now I have carpal tunnel, so now back to slides. So see how it goes. We'll see if I like it. Oh, I don't need to open it here, but so I posted those. I'm going to be writing on them, right? But it saves me a little bit of writing. My writing's not that nice anyways, so even on a good day. So and then I'll post the notes that I've written on as well. Okay. All right. So nothing to it but to do it. Here we go. Chapter 1. Oh my gosh. I'm not going to warm up or anything. There's nothing to review. Course outline? No. Chapter 1, introduction to data. We're going to start with just data basics. So like anything, no worries. We need a lot of terminology, right? We need to be able to talk about data, right? And so that's where we're going to start today, is just kind of a lot of terms, right? But that's just what we have to do. Okay? Let's just talk about what statistics is for a second, though. Okay, so I just intuitively, you probably know that has something to do with collecting data. And then if someone prompted you and said, oh, well, do you analyze data? Yeah, probably. And then what do you do with those data? Well, I mean, you probably use it to draw conclusions, right? And so that's exactly what it is. And so we're going to start here just briefly talking about collecting data. Now, we're not going to spend a ton of time here because it's one of those things that you should really hire a professional for, okay? And so we'll talk about why that is today, but it's kind of intricate work and not really for the beginner. But it's good to know the rules of the road, how should data be collected, that kind of thing. And then later on in the course, we'll talk about analyzing, right? And then drawing conclusions. Okay. So to get us started, hey, why is it so large? They did an update on notability. You can't tell here, but on my end, it's way different, so I'm all lost. That's not your problem. But just as an example, let's say we did a classroom survey. Now, we're not going to do that because it takes time, whatever. And I don't know if I'm allowed to collect this information, but anyways. Got an intro stats class just like this one, and I might ask you, what's your gender? Are you an introvert or an extrovert? I don't know. I'm an introvert. Although there's kind of things saying, oh, there's no such thing as either or. Anyways, whatever. Doesn't matter. How many hours of sleep do you get at night on average? Okay. What time do you usually go to bed? What you'll notice is a lot of the questions that, I don't know, I guess I end up picking have to do with sleep. I don't know, it's weird. But countries, how many countries have you visited? That one's tough to answer, I think. And on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you dread being here? 1, everyone's feeling confident. I'm assuming it starts at 1 where you're not scared at all. 5, you're super scared. I don't know, it would have to be defined. But these are just examples, right? Things that we could ask, right? And then if you think about, okay, you've collected all this information, how would you store it? Probably open up a spreadsheet. I don't know, it's an idea, right? And how would you organize it? Probably have each student as a row, right? So each observation, and then maybe their answers to each of the questions in the columns, right? And bada boom, bada bing, you've made a data matrix. Easy as pie, right? And so this is typically how we store data, right, that we've collected. So we've got the observations here. So student number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, whatever. And then the results to each of those answers. So these general categories are called variables, okay, because they vary. So the results vary from observation to observation, okay. And part of what we're going to talk about today and what's super, super important is deciding what type of variable you have, okay. That's going to be, I can't stress this enough, very important, because the type of variable that you have is going to dictate the right type of analysis that you're going to do. And there are 2 distinct paths that you could go down, okay? Such as, this table. They thought of everything, I know, it's crazy. So you have all these variables, right? So all the, let's see if I can. Variables are the columns in your spreadsheet, right? So all variables can be split into numerical variables or categorical variables, okay? Numerical are things that, well, they're numbers, right? There are some sneaky numbers, right, that we'll talk about. But in general, if it's a number, and my kind of intuitive thing is, does it make sense to talk about the average of it, right? Average age makes sense, average height makes sense, all those things. And so here, what I'll say is, for the numerical, does the average make sense? Right, or something like that. Does it make sense to think about the average, to report on the average, right? Does it make sense to report on the average phone number, for example? It's one of those sneaky ones. Not really, right? Means nothing, okay? And so I use this as a gatekeeper because there are some variables where you could go either way, and it depends on how you want to present your information, right? Maybe you want to talk about the average of something, right? Maybe you want to just talk about the different groups. So categorical, kind of a dead giveaway, right? You have categories, and for categorical variables, what we do is we just have counts in each category, right? So going back to here, introvert or extrovert. How would we report that, right? The average person is an intro extrovert. No, doesn't make sense, right? We would say, oh, we had 40 extroverts and 46 introverts, right? We would be reporting counts in each category. So here, whoops, we would report counts in each category. Oops. Now I'm going to stick to calling them numerical or categorical, but if you've taken any sort of stats course before, fields have different terms, which is part of the problem with stats, right? Because numerical could be called quantitative. And categorical could be called qualitative, right? There are clues in there. I'm pretty big on etymology, right? The kind of dissecting words and origins of words, because there are a lot of clues in there, right? Quantitative, it's a quantity, numerical, qualitative, has qualities, qualitative. But I'll stick to numerical and categorical just because they trigger more for me. Yeah? And that's what the textbook does. And wouldn't that be confusing if I didn't follow what they did? I'm going to say don't worry too much about, so there are layers upon layers upon layers of different classification schemes for these variables. If you're in psychology, for example, they take like step. There's like 7 subgroups in each of these. We're not going to do that. That's crazy. For them, it's important, right? But for us, we can just stick up here, right? And so just as follow through, a numerical variable can be either continuous, so if it's on just any sort of number scale, right? Or it can be discrete. Discrete values are a subset of the continuous values, right? Because they're just whole values, right? And they've got kind of distinct chopping or stepping stones, let's call them. Chop, Howard. I don't really differentiate between the two. I talk about the average either way, right? And we analyze the average. Okay. I would like to add that instead of just the categorical variable, ordinal, or here they have regular categorical, I would call it nominal, but it's just, I guess I'm just showing off. It's not important. I want to put it out there. Okay, ordinal data is when it has some natural ordering, right? The reason it's not important in this course is if it came up later on in your analytical career, you would naturally deal with it appropriately. For example, ordinal data would be something like first year, second year, third year, fourth year. If those are the categories on your x-axis, how would you organize those? Third year, second year, first year, fourth year? No, probably not. Probably order them in the order that they naturally appear, right? First year, second year, third year, fourth year. Fifth year, victory lap. I did one myself. It's hard to decide. Anyways. But for us, I want you to just focus on those two. Okay. The reason this is so important is, like I said, it's going to dictate how we're going to analyze things. And in general, let's see here. What color haven't I used? Green, maybe. This is going to be starting in chapter 5 and chapter 6. And this is going to be chapter, no, not 6, chapter 7. All right. So kind of huge distinctions here. Okay. But also as a roadmap. Trouble with this course is there's a lot of kind of housekeeping things that we need to do at the beginning of the term. Once we get through that, then you guys are in for a treat. Starting in chapter 5. That's a lot of housekeeping, Emily. I know. All right. Of course, one of the skills that we need to have is, given some sort of data matrix or a spreadsheet like this, we need to be able to maybe look at a description of the variable, or with clues from the data set, figure out if something's numerical or categorical. Right? And then if we want to show off, we can go discrete, continuous, ordinal, nominal. Hey, I didn't say what nominal was. It's in the word. No order. Nominal. That's things like hair color. I guess you could do it by shade. No, too complicated. All right. So here we have this data matrix with clues, right? And what we're going to do is just look at this and say, and we have the descriptions as well, but I think we got it. We're going to figure out which one's which. So we'll start with gender. Feels like an easy one. Categorical, right? So I'll do for the categorical ones. I mean, it's nominal because there's no order. Sure, let's show off. How about sleep? It was the average number of hours of sleep you get per night, right? So remember, my clue was, does it make sense to talk about the average? Though kind of confusing, we would be talking about the average of the average number of hours, but we can do that. That's allowed. So I'm going to go ahead and lock it in numerical. Continuous or discrete? I get 7.956 hours on average. But I could on average. So I'm going to go with continuous. So the continuous is, and there's just kind of gray areas as well, right? Age, for example, I am an exact age, but I would say that I'm 37, I think, ish. For the longest time, when I was 28, I started telling people I was 30. And then after 30 till about like 32, I would still say I was 30. So I was like 30 for 4 years. Looked forward to it so much. Then I just got used to it. Now I'm just confused. Anyways. How about the bedtime? I'm gonna go with categorical. Just because you could talk. So this is one of those, I could be convinced. Okay. And that is the tricky part with stats in general is, how would you convince me that you're going to use bedtime as numerical instead of categorical? So I say I'm going to use it as categorical. Why? Because I want to talk about the counts of people in each time frame, right? That's how I want to report this data. If you wanted to report on the average bedtime, that's fine. Then it's numerical, right? So this is one of those where you could convince me either way. Okay? And there will be questions like that on, not a lot. I usually warn you ahead of time. But on the tests, for example, where if you use sound logic, such as, I would like to report on the average bedtime. Okay, I'm sure. I wouldn't, because these look like categories to me, right? But who am I to say? I don't make the rules. I do, I guess. I'm gonna say either categorical to report counts or numerical to report the average. Number of countries, as soon as it's the number of something, it's going to be numerical, right? And so I don't know if I could, well, I mean, it's finite. I could count it, I guess. Hey, I just noticed, oops. We're not going to tackle this, but did they not answer, or is it 0? There's a difference, right? Things to look out for. Not today. But little Easter egg. All right. How about the dread? It was on a scale of 1 to 5. Presumably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, nothing in between. It's another one of those where I could be convinced either way, right? I want to talk about the average dreadometer. Can we say that? Or I want to talk about the counts in each group, right? Personally, I would probably be more interested in the counts again, right? But whatever you want to report on. But Emily would do categorical. But like I said, I could be convinced. As long as you use the right, as long as you say the right things. No? Hey, I already gave this one away. Type of variable is a telephone area code. I have to go with, even though it's a number, right? It's going to be categorical, right? 250. It's not a number. I'm not 250th in line for something, right? It means I'm calling for. It means at some point I started a cell phone plan here in the Okanagan, or I think it was just rural BC. Anywhere outside the Lower Mainland, outside of 604. Now we have others, right? But that one's kind of a tricky one, right? Because you've got 250 is a number, or 778, or whatever it is people have these days, whatever it is the cool kids have. But the average is not, oh, sorry guys, is not interesting. Right. I'd be more interested in the counts. 250, 604, 778. Are there new ones? Or those 206? 236? I thought that was Ontario. I don't pick those up. But I don't pick up any numbers. As soon as it has the first, is it 6 digits that are the same as yours? It's guaranteed a random digit dialer because they just randomly generate the last 4. And then because it looks like your number, you pick up. Right? Like, oh, it's a local. I must know them. You don't. It's randomly generated. So a lot of the time we're interested in the relationship between 2 variables, okay? And just as a little bit of review, we'll review it again when it comes up. but we've got the x-axis here and we've got the y-axis here. Right. What we're going to do is we're going to put what we call the response variable, okay, on the y-axis. So here, this is where the response variable goes. It's also called the dependent variable. Another one of those scenarios where we have multiple terminology depending on what field you're in. So, or dependent. Of course, just because I use some terminology, if you're, well versed in some other terminology, I will know what you mean. It's just confusing if you're trying to follow along and I jump around, which is what my prof used to do. It's like, oh, whatever, X's and Y's, it doesn't matter. Well, of course it does. It turns out it doesn't, but I didn't know that. And then I like to call the one on the x-axis the explanatory variable, mostly because it has the x in it. Just kind of nudge me along. But it can also be called the independent variable. We'll come back to this, but that's just kind of something that I didn't find in the notes, and it's nice to start off there. With two variables, right? One of the main things, and if we're graphing them like this, one thing that we kind of start off with is these are both numerical variables, right? We can handle a categorical variable here, just makes it a little bit different. So typically we have two numerical variables and we visualize them with a scatter plot like this. And what we're doing is we're looking to see if there's a relationship between the hours of study per week and the GPA of the student. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and say it's not as strong as I thought it would be, right? I was expecting kind of, well, I'll throw all these terms at you, more of a correlation, right? I was expecting kind of tighter dots, right? This parcel, I mean, they're pretty close to a 4.0, so that's good, this one. But they're also studying 70 hours a week. So, whoa, no, it's a bad line. But when we're looking at this, anything jump out at you? Maybe it's hard to see because it's kind of small. This one, right? Uh-oh. Someone's got more than a 4.0. I'll talk to the registrar. I'll do this. It's possible once we remove that, maybe kind of the scale, I don't think it would make a huge difference, but maybe it would kind of get that shape that I'm looking for. Now we're not going to do regression, which is what this is when we fit a line to model this relationship. We're not going to do that until chapter 8. But I like to end on a high note, so that's why I like to do that, because then you're on easy street. I hope. It's my goal. Okay. So here's a different scatter plot. It's the head length and the skull width of possums. And I think it's a special possum that she uses. That doesn't matter. I'm trying to remember it. No. Right, but we've got the head length and the skull width. Now, I would say you could have swapped the X and Y axis here, right? There's no clear way to determine which one should be the explanatory variable and which one should be the response variable, in the sense that head length, does it affect the skull width? Yes, it does. Does the skull width affect the head length? Yes, it does. Right. So I'm talking about it with not actually saying it. It's hard. We'll get there. All right. So which of the following statements is correct? I don't really like these types of questions. You have to read so much. But anyways, so there is no relationship between head length and skull width, so the variables are independent. I would disagree. Why? Because I already see, just looking at this, I can see that things are kind of all moving in the same direction, right? And so that means that this one, let's do a red one. How jarring. No. Head length and skull width are positively associated. I'd have to agree. All right, because they're all going up in the positive direction. If it was down, right, you could have a relationship going down, that's fine, but then it would be negative, right? And so here, but if it's positive, it can't be negative. So that saves me a little bit of reading there. Don't do what I just did. Read the whole thing. A longer head causes the skull to be wider. No, I don't want you saying stuff like that. Okay. Causation is very, very finicky. The only way that we can talk about causation is through a completely controlled experiment, okay, which is very, very rare. We can talk about associations, right? There's a relationship, we're allowed to say that. But like I said, what you'll find in this course is that words matter, right? So just throwing things out like causation or causes, you don't want to do that. In fact, here, no. And same thing here. No thanks. Again with the causation. Which I have a note on later when we talk about experiments, so that's why I'm not writing it down now. But you can throw it in there, just for fun. So we're going to talk about just relationships and associations for the most part. In general, I can't think of an ethical experiment that you would do in business. I mean, A/B testing maybe, force people to visit one version of the website, force people to go to another version of the website. But even then, people are choosing to visit your website, right, in the first place. So pretty rare that you would be doing experiments. So, like I said, what we will be able to talk about is associations. Okay, so when two variables show some connection with one another, we can say that they're associated or related. Right? Or a relationship, I'll say, not necessarily related. So you could also call them dependent on each other, right? The skull width depends on the head length or whatever it was, that kind of thing. If two variables are not associated, right, then we call them independent. Now, that would look like what? In a scatter plot, that would just look like random dots, right? In fact, there is some kind of activity here once you kind of surpass 40 hours of studying per week, seems to improve your GPA, right? But up to 40 hours, it just looks like a cloud here, right? And in terms of fitting a line, you can fit a line like this, and you can fit a line like this. You can fit a line straight through, which is where it would go, right? And so then that tells me that there's no relationship there. Okay? So that's what it would look like in terms of a scatter plot, right? Just random scatter, oops. On the scatter plot. So the data that we're going to work with mostly is going to be from observational studies. And of course, there are many different techniques on how to collect this data. We're just going to introduce a few. And this is where I would say, oh, just hire a professional, make them do it. It's worth the money, I promise. You can pay me. No, I don't like sampling. So usually a data collection process would start something like this. Hey, I have a research question. Can people become better, more efficient runners on their own merely by running? Well, what do you have to first identify? Identify the population that you're interested in, right? Then what do you have to do? You have to take a sample from that population. Now, it's going to be very important that that sample is representative of the population, because in the end, your conclusions can only be, I'm trying to not use the word inference, can only be applied, let's say, to the group that you sampled from, right? So in this case, if the population of interest is all people, right? Can people become better? Blah, 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 right? So then my population of interest is all people. Should probably narrow that down a little bit, right? Can adults? That seems like a simple first step. Kids, you can make them just run, and they will be better. I think. I guess I need to do the study. But all people, right? We should probably narrow this down. Okay, so, oops. Should specify, because what can happen, and what happens very often, is what if we took a sample of a group of adult women who recently joined a running group, right? It's not really representative of all people, right? It's representative of adult women. And I'm going to take it a step further, who recently joined a running group, right? They want to be better runners, presumably. So here, where's my red pen? Not representative of the population. I guess I should say of interest, but around, so it just says int. So then the results that we get, we can't generalize them to all people. And that's the biggest mistake that I see. And, you know, you read articles and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden they're generalizing to what they wanted to be able to talk about. But here we can really only generalize to adult women. And I would even specify the running club bit, but they're being generous, I think. And that's only if the data are randomly sampled. Let's see here. I want a more pleasant color than red. How about pink? Random sampling is the best way to ensure that your sample is representative of the population. Now, am I going to have room to say all that? Let's see here. Random sampling is the best way to, I need more room. Best way to ensure the sample is representative of the population. Before we talk about sampling, there's just some terminology. It's not, we'll just kind of breeze through it. But there is such a thing as anecdotal evidence, which gets kind of overused, right? And so things like, my uncle smokes 3 packs a day and he's in perfectly good health, and that's supposed to be evidence that smoking is fine, I guess. That's bad sampling. Bad sampling. I'll use a red pen. Bad sampling. We'll start by talking about the bad sampling. Anecdotal evidence, that's bad. There's more, but that's just for fun. The obvious way to get a sample that's representative of the entire population would be to sample the entire population, right? Seems logical, but also sounds very expensive and difficult / impossible, right? And so, but that's called a census, and I know you've heard of a census, and I don't know if they brought them back. You should probably know. Stats can and all. But anyways, we used to do a census, and even then, they didn't actually sample everyone, but because it's impossible. But the problem with the census is the population. If we're talking about humans, especially, right? Population is constantly evolving, right? And so changing. People move all the time, for example. Never mind the morbid stuff, right? And so, so a census is just not reasonable, okay? And what's interesting is, although that would sound supreme, right? Well, I took a census. This is a census. Isn't that awesome? A sample can be more robust, right? And so we can get kind of better information from a sample than we can from a census sometimes, often. Problem with the census is, well, this is just an example. Even when you send out a census, there's no guarantee that everyone's going to fill it out for obvious reasons. So what we can do is we can take a sample. Way more cost effective, right? To just take a small group. And I think we all kind of intuitively understand a sample is a subgroup of the population that we're interested in. And the difficult part is making sure that it's representative of the population. Okay. And so I stole these slides from one of the authors, Mina, and if I met her, I'd be just fangirling so hard. Anyways, she's awesome, and she's got lots of information out there, but she's got this cute example about, you've got a huge pot of soup. You don't need to taste the whole thing to make sure the salt's good or whatever. You can just take a spoonful, same idea. And so you can do some exploratory analysis. A lot of analysis that I would do when I was working in the field is mostly exploratory analysis. What's going on out there? What's the data telling me? Careful not to dig and find what you want to find, but just kind of exploring. Okay? And so that's like tasting the soup, right? You're just seeing what's out there. Okay? And then the inference part, which is what we're kind of building up towards in this course, is when we take that information from the sample to learn about the whole population. Okay? So here, inference is taking information from the sample to learn about the population, or to infer something about the population. That's the meat and potatoes of this course. Like I said, there's just a lot of housekeeping that we need to do before we can start doing that. All right, kind of building up to it. But that's where we're headed, right? How can I take a sample average to learn about the population average, right? I don't want to take the whole population. I just want to have a rough idea of what the average female height is, right, of some population. And I can do that with a sample. So again, only if your sample is representative of the population that you want to talk about. Okay. Before we can talk about good sampling, we'll come back to some bad sampling. Bad sampling is anything where there's sampling bias. So I'll make a note here, right? This is bad sampling. Bias is systematically favoring an outcome, right? And so that can happen in a few common ways, lots of different ways, but a few common ones. And so sampling bias would be things like non-response bias, right? So you send out this survey, let's say to all students, and I think the registrar does that, and the school does it all the time. They send out surveys. They don't send them to all students, I don't think. That'd be weird. Maybe they do. But if you don't respond, then there's non-response bias, because there could be multiple reasons why you're not responding, right? And that would make it not representative of the population anymore, right? Those people that don't respond, right? Maybe they got something to hide. A big problem that we're seeing kind of now with, I don't know, Facebook polls and online polls and whatever, is the voluntary response bias. I think that one's pretty intuitive, right? You're only going to answer a poll like that. Like this one is not that controversial, but do you get paid sick days at your job? Yes, no, what job? Yes. And I don't know. I probably wouldn't answer that. Like, who cares? Well, should care, but yeah, of course we do. But yes, a lot of people said yes. Some people said no, and people said what job? I don't know. I don't know why you would answer this, honestly. But some people felt strongly, so they responded. But you can only generalize your answers to people who would answer this poll online, right? Which is not ideal. Another problem is a convenience sample, right? If you want to talk about, Okanagan College students, let's keep it here. But then you only sample here at the Kelowna campus, and you don't go to Salmon Arm, and you don't go to Penticton, don't go to Vernon. Well, that's convenient for you, but it's a convenient sample. So what's the problem then? You could only generalize to the Kelowna campus, right? kind of a famous example of, yeah.
Can you go back 2 slides? I just have a question about like the inferencing of samples.
Hit me.
Just to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly, like if you were to dip a spoon into the soup, it would be representative because it's that pot of soup, right? But
yeah.
Hypothetically, what if you just happen to dip in your spoon and you get one part of that soup that's not salty? And so you inference the entire pot is not salty, but that might not be correct. And
risky business, right?
Follow-up question is, how many times, is there a way to know how many times you would have to dip your spoon in for the result of this is or isn't salty to be valid or correct?
So the first part is statistics. That problem of how do I know what if I just took a bad sample, right? What if this sample is not representative of the population? There's no way that we can know that. And typically we only do it once, right? We only collect a sample once because we can't afford to do it multiple times or whatever. But what statistics is putting a little error bounds on. So assuming I have a representative sample, then this is what's happening. But it's always leaving room for, well, I could be wrong, right? And so that's, you pinpointed what statistics is putting those error bounds on there and saying, well, there's a chance that I was wrong. Right. Nice. And yeah, we usually only taste once, so to speak. But if everything's done correctly, then we're allowed to assume that it was representative, but we build in those buffers, I call them, right? Where it's all out the window, but we don't know that. Nice. I'm gonna have to jot that one down. So a really famous example of kind of taking too big of a sample, that sounds like a good thing, right? So there's this fine balance between, you want to have a big sample. I think we learned that from a relatively early age, right? When you start talking about data and stuff. Maybe you don't talk about data, I don't know. But when you first start talking about data, you learn, okay, bigger samples, bigger, that's better, right? And so, I don't know who Landon is, but he lost against Roosevelt, and it was this huge thing. So in 1936, the Literary Digest poll, which has since died because they predicted it so wrong. So they polled about 10 million Americans, which in 1936 is very impressive. Okay. And they got responses from about 2.4 million. Now, 2.4 million is a huge sample, right? Potentially too big, right? One of the problems would be 2.4 out of 10 isn't that great, right? So there's that aspect, but we're not going to dig into that too much. Okay. But the poll showed that Landon was going to win, no doubt about it. Lock it in. Okay. And so, of course, Roosevelt won. Yeah. The problem ended up being that the magazine had surveyed, well, one, its own readers. Okay. It's kind of a problem. But that's what we're seeing, with online polls and stuff too. So tale as old as time. Registered automobile owners, 1936. Don't know if I would have been in that group, maybe. Registered telephone users, again, 1936. These are pretty snazzy folks we're surveying here, right? And so, although these last two, I would argue, are relatively representative, right? As long as you kind of put it in the footnotes somewhere. We only surveyed people with a phone and not even landlines anymore. There's that sweet, what was it, like 10 years where landlines were reliable? maybe 20. Golden time of sampling. Landlines, no one has landlines. Anyways, and so obviously kind of reaching a different group than the whole population who votes, right? And so very bad because it was biased, right? Favoring a certain outcome. And so if the soup is not well stirred, going back to the soup, which I think is really cute, it doesn't matter how large a spoon you have, right? But if it's well stirred, then a small spoon will suffice. That's the balance with sampling as well, right? You can take a small sample as long as it's a good representative sample. And I really hope that I get to talk about good samples next. I don't. Not yet. But I'll let you do this one on your own, and when I post the notes, I'll circle the right answer. But we'll keep moving here. Got better things to do. So what we talk about mostly are observational studies, okay? We just observe information, right? So most information that we have, or most data that we have, are just observational studies. Okay. Those studies can be prospective or retrospective, right? Prospective, retrospective, right? So in the future, or collecting past data, right? Looking at, well, what's happened before, analyzing that, right? Just terminology to keep in mind. But again, etymology is your friend, right? Retrospective in the past, prospective in the future. Finally, good samples. There are many different methods that we could use to collect good representative samples, but at its core, it's going to be randomly selecting individuals, right? Or whatever observations you want, okay? If observational data are not randomly selected, that's going to impact, well, it's going to impact everything. It ruins everything. The estimates that you have, right? So the average height of a group that's not representative doesn't tell me anything, right? That kind of thing. And so in the end, the results are not reliable, okay, if you don't have random sampling. So some commonly used random sampling techniques are simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and cluster sampling. You can go on multi-stage sampling, which is like a mashup of 2 or more different sampling techniques. But we're just going to talk about simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and cluster sampling. This simple, oh, maybe I'll put it on the next page. Simple random sampling is often abbreviated SRS. I like to joke that stratified random sampling is also SRS, but it's not. So simple random sampling is exactly as it sounds, most basic form, but it's reliable, right? You can get reasonable results. The only problem is it can be expensive. So here, you just randomly select cases from the population, okay? And there are many different ways of doing that, right? But what does it require? It requires that you have the population, right? A defined population that you're drawing from, right? Or reasonably. Okay. You can use a random number generator, right? If you're lucky enough to have a list of student names, for example, to draw a random sample, random number generator of the same number of students that you have, add them in, sort them, take the first 10. That's random. You can go to each student, flip a coin, heads you're in, tails you're out. Flip a coin, flip a coin, flip a coin. Or no, you guys flip your own coins. Tell me if you're in or out, right? That kind of thing. No, I should do it. More robust. Anyways, lots of different ways that you could do random sampling. But that's why I say maybe get someone else to do it, the actual randomization. But this is what it looks like. It's exactly as it sounds. Simple random sample. Okay. Later on, when we're analyzing the data, one of the conditions that we have to satisfy and make sure are satisfied is that we have a random sample. So usually a question would start with, you collect an SRS of 46 manatees. I know this is a business stats course, but I like to throw in a lot of animals. It's just more fun. A stratified sample now is when you have strata. Okay? Now strata have similar observations. They don't have to be the same, but they're generally homogeneous, right? I would say maybe first year, second year, third year, fourth year, that kind of thing. You've got these kind of distinct groups that are relatively homogeneous, right? And so here you've got homogeneous groups, relative. So you've got these strata, usually naturally occurring strata, so they're not necessarily the same size as you can see here. But what you do is you take a simple random sample from each stratum. Okay? So that's stratified random sampling. And then you put all those together. Usually you'll have an indicator of which strata people came from, that kind of thing. Okay. Versus cluster sampling. Clusters, as opposed to strata, are not necessarily homogeneous, right? You've got these clusters, but I don't know, they could be kind of arising from different things, but they're not necessarily homogeneous observations. They're just naturally occurring clusters. Different campuses, Penticton, Kelowna, Vernon, that kind of thing. Right? And then, so cluster sampling is when we randomly select clusters and we sample everyone in that cluster. Right? So here we randomly selected cluster 3, 4, and 8. Great. And then we sample everyone in that cluster. Okay? But we don't have anyone from any of these other clusters, and that can be a problem. It can be a real cluster. I don't like it when this happens. We haven't talked about blocked sampling. I don't do that. It's just I stole these, so scratch that. It doesn't exist. Or maybe it exists. Maybe I don't know what it is, but we're not talking about it. So city council has requested a household survey be conducted in a suburban area of their city. The area is broken into many distinct and unique neighborhoods, some including large homes, some with only apartments. Which approach would likely be the least effective? I'm hearing, and that's right. I wouldn't want to do a cluster sample here in this case, right? One of the concerns and what I can't control is, what if I only sample large homes, right? What if I don't sample any apartment buildings, for example? And so with simple random sampling, I would definitely have, a spread. Stratified sampling, right? Randomly sampling within each strata, that's a good choice as well, right? But cluster sampling, there's real potential for missing something. I can't believe I'm gonna do it. Experiments. Well, we're not talking about experiments. But I will just have a slide on the principles of experimental design in case anyone asks. I can say, yeah, I said stuff about it. But we're not going to talk about experiments. It's way too big of a topic. It doesn't really apply to us, like I said. But experiments, you know, we all kind of have an idea of experiments. You're in a lab, you're controlling every aspect, and usually you're blocking, which I think is where they got that block sampling from or whatever. But like I said, too much. It's more for a second course in statistics where we talk about analyzing data from an experiment, which we're not going to do. I will say this though, this is a roundabout way, very confusing graphic. It's very intense. The reason I kept it is for this. Because what I said before was the only way that I could have a causal conclusion is if I've done an experiment. Not only that, a completely controlled experiment where I've randomly assigned my subjects to whatever treatment they're getting, but also randomly sampling the information that I've collected, right? That's very extreme. Only then, right, that's the ideal experiment. Only then can you establish a causal conclusion, right? We can talk about relationships, associations, that kind of thing, but no causation. My first stats course, I had he turned into he was my supervisor later for my master's, but he used to yell, "Correlation does not imply causation." Whoa, jeez, man. But it stuck. So now that's all I hear. This mean voice. He wasn't mean, but he yelled a lot. Swore a lot. Different times, right? If there's no random sampling, but you randomly assign things in an experiment, then you can talk about causation, but only to that sample, right? In this sample, we saw that this, right? This fertilizer gave me bigger tomatoes. I don't know, whatever. All right. And if there's no random assignment, then you're hooped. There's no causation. And this is where most observational studies are. Hopefully you randomly sampled, right? If you didn't, then it's just bad. They said it couldn't be done. All of chapter 1 in one day. I release you. Good job, guys. Any questions? All right.